All right, this video is going to be a complete guide to card games. That's customizable card games, also known as trading card games, really targeted at the beginner player, new to card games in North America, because that's what I know. So if you're already playing any of these games, there's not going to be a whole lot of information here in this video that you don't already know from playing at the store. But if you are new to these games, then this will be a very comprehensive guide. We're going to go over what card games are and aren't in this in this context, and why you should and shouldn't play them, and some alternatives in that respect. Then we're going to discuss really every card game that's currently active in North America, and then we'll discuss really how to find them and play them, and the actual process of playing these games. So this is just going to be me talking here. I got some notes here, but I don't think we're going to have any visuals otherwise, but I will put timestamps and chapters there in the video. And definitely post below if you got any questions or comments on the video, but we'll jump in here. So really the thesis here is that card games offer a competitive experience, and it's the easiest way to find competitive matches and play them. And my audience here on this channel, are kind of spoiled on video games. That's kind of the standard that we're expecting now. But in real life, it's difficult to find those. So the closest game that really has that aspect here in North America is chess. So every town of any size at all has a chess club, and they'll meet like Thursday night at some library or something like that, and you can get chess matches at your rating there. But chess, at a club level even, is an entirely different game. It definitely has its problems, it has its charms and its features, but there's some aspects of it, mostly due to the fact that it's a stagnant game that doesn't change, and that's, the best and worst thing about it in some ways. But these card games offer a constantly evolving metagame of options available to you. So the game is constantly changing for these games as new sets get released, and even within a set, as people learn different ways to play these different decks involved. We'll get into the discussion here, but the game is constantly changing, and that can be the best and worst thing about these card games. So we're more familiar with board games. Something like chess, of course, could be considered a board game. And while some modern board games do offer expansions and such, they're still relatively stagnant. And the experience of modern board gaming has its drawbacks, unfortunately. Generally, you're spending a lot of time teaching new players to play board games, probably more time teaching new players to play board games than you are actually playing the game. And it's almost rare to get sufficient players up to a level where you can actually seriously compete and play to win and really play the game as it's meant to be played, instead of just playing at the speed or the skill level of the lowest player in the group and just always having to play with kid gloves or something like that. It's much more satisfying in some ways to have a real match where you just show up and you're playing to win, and it's just your opponent's there, and you don't have to take this extra social steps of building the group and scheduling the night or anything like that. You just go to the place at the time, sit at the table you're assigned, play the person you're assigned, play the game, and you just play the win, and that's the game. And that's relatively rare aside from these sort of things. So that's, I think, the biggest reason to play. You can't always just play video games if you want to go out in the real world and play some competitive games. This is the best way to do that, in my opinion. And that just doesn't exist with the board games. So we're talking about card games here. We're not just merely talking about games that are played with cards. We're very familiar with classic card games, hearts and spades and poker and blackjack and any number of games, almost of different genres, can be played with a deck of cards. There's boxed card games that are sold much like a board game, except it consists entirely of cards. The big example would be Uno. Um, and then there's other games, Villainous comes to mind, where it's got a lot of similar mechanics to the card games that we're going to talk about, except it's just in a boxed form. Sometimes these games have expansions and stuff like that. Even Uno has expansions now. And if you're really unfamiliar with card games, one of the analogies I like to draw with people familiar with Uno is that in Uno, everybody's drawing from one shared deck of shuffled cards there. And in these sort of card games, everybody has their own deck. And you can build your own deck beforehand, swap out the cards in there, and build your entire deck towards a particular strategy. So in Uno, you could have an entire deck where all of your cards were doing skip turns or something like that, or everything was making your opponent draw a bunch of cards on everything. And then the matchups would be playing your skip turn deck against somebody else's draw a whole bunch deck and see which deck comes out on top. Offhand, it sounds like the skip turn deck would be pretty strong. But it would depend on what cards are available to you, what you're able to put in that deck, and such like that. But that's where we start approaching these sort of card games that we're talking about. There are games that even more closely resemble these sort of card games, so-called deck building games. Usually these games have a shared set of cards that you're able to draft from, and you're picking from that set in order to build your deck in order to play against the other people in the game. This brings in a lot of the complicated mechanics from card games, but my problem with these games has always been that these mechanics are never as complicated or rewarding as they are in a full CCG or TCG. The deck building games tend to be very simple mechanics, only a few mechanics in them, and not the hundreds and thousands of cards available in a full CCG. So while they can be fun in their own way, they lack the depth, and then they also don't have this constantly evolving metagame that we love and hate about an active card game. That said, if you're liking the mechanics there, this can be a much simpler way to enjoy those mechanics. So this kind of brings the discussion of what you're looking for in the game and who you're looking to play with. For example, if you got a girlfriend, you got a wife, you got kids or something like that, you got family or even roommates that you're always playing games with, it might make more sense to go with a box game, a deck building game, something like that. You just buy the game, you play it in your living room, you enjoy it with the people that you would be playing with anyways. It doesn't make sense to play a much more expensive game and then go pay to play it somewhere else, if what you really want to be doing is just playing with these same people anyways. So you can overcome some of the tedium of board games by getting a group involved in a more complicated game like a deck building game or something like that. And that may match your lifestyle and play group better. Me as the single man, like I said, it makes more sense for me to play a game where I can go to the store and sit down and get an opponent and not have to schedule a bunch of things or find people to play with or anything like that. It's just the opponent's right there waiting for me, almost in a sense. So there are games that are, a step even closer to the CCGs, TCGs, and that would be a living card game, and that's something like a deck building game, but well, it's really more like the customization of a card game. But whereas TCGs and CCGs, and I should mention, that's really the same thing, of course, just different branding. Those sort of card games are sold randomly. You're buying random packs of cards. And if you remove that element of it, it seems like a very pro-consumer move, and you end up with this business model of something called a living card game. That's a term that Fantasy Flight Publishing came up with and used for their games. Their big one there was the Lord of the Rings game, and that was released in small expansions, but they were fixed expansions where you're just buying that set of cards, and there was a ton of those expansions for years. And the rights, of course, has always been an issue when they have the rights and stuff to publish. And right now, I think they have the rights to publish their old cards but not make new cards. And what they've been doing is re-releasing their old expansions in new, larger box sets. So there's like 6 or 9 box sets to buy. It's not inexpensive, but if you love Lord of the Rings, and you can get those boxes, that can be a good option. But there's only so many cards. So there's not going to be more cards in that game. With Fantasy Flight, all of their games, even aside from the licensing issues they're just, once they're out of print, they're impossible to find. They're except expensive on the secondary market, and they don't keep their old stuff in print generally, so it's almost impossible to get into any of these games. It's been a constant problem for them. It's something that the business model hasn't really solved. It just makes it harder to get into these games almost. So they have this other game, Arkham Horror. Arkham Horror was originally a board game, and then they made this living card game out of it, and it had been suffering from that problem. If you wanted to get into Arkham Horror, good luck finding anything but the most recent expansions on the shelves. But they're just about to release a second edition. We'll see what they can do about those problems. Might be a good time to get into that again if you're looking for that boxed or living card game experience rather than the full-fledged CCGs seeing huge expansions every couple months of random cards that have varying price. The big job, this seems, like I said, it seems like an obvious pro-consumer move. The problem is these games have never developed any sort of social or competitive scene. Because everyone has the same cards, it just very quickly dilutes to what the optimal deck is, and then everybody would play the same deck. It just doesn't hold that same kind of customization or exploration that a larger card game has. And so it tends to be very stale, and there's just never been a successful game with that sort of model. So these games have always been better for fixed play groups that are just playing this game. But once you have that group, that can be a very good game. The way it tends to work is just one person has to buy everything and the other people get to play it. But that can work for your group or not. These games are not cheap either. Like I mentioned, the Lord of the Rings games was always expensive. Arkham Horror, I'm sure the second edition will find ways to make it even more expensive to play. There are alternative games here. One is Earthborn Rangers. It's kind of similar mechanics where each person has, an arranger rather than an investigator in Arkham Horror. And it's kind of a survival game in some sense. You against the world there, and you're kind of exploring and trying to do missions and whatever else. So kind of similar genres there, but different setting genres completely. They also have this game called Marvel, the card game. So again, it's gonna have those same problems, but if you like Marvel, then it can be huge because then you're buying an expansion, and it's like Iron Man expansion or Wolverine expansion or whatever else, and then it's all the cards you need to play Wolverine, and then you just play as Wolverine, and you're playing against, Doctor Doom or whatever, and you buy the Doctor Doom expansion or whatever other villains and stuff like that. And so, the business model is kind of obvious there, and it's perfect for some people, but um, has its problems again. And just to contrast with the full card game, this kind of thing again results in somebody generally buying everything and other people playing, and if they're lucky, it's the same play group, so he doesn't have to constantly explain the rules of the game and keep everybody up. But it's just the same kind of problems as board games in a lot of ways, where you just want to play the game, and that's impossible in some ways. I should mention with the Marvel, there is also a less expensive alternative. With the Marvel, you're paying for this Fantasy Flight publishing model, and you're paying for the Marvel license and whatever else there. Where Sentinels of the Universe is kind of basically the same game, but you know, Marvel card game at home. So something to look into if that piques your interest more, because it's more like a retro comic book vibe, and fewer expansions and stuff like that, but still they're doing like yearly expansions or whatever in that game, where they just drop a bunch of new cards and stuff like that. um and so that's living card games. Like I said, if you got a fixed group, you're just playing with your roommates or whatever you got in your life, these games might make a lot of sense. And it wouldn't make sense to play a much more expensive game for that experience. But as I've pointed out here, that you know, just in my experience in my life, and I'm sure in many of yours as well, it's just not convenient to maintain a board game group on whatever nights and keep everybody up trying to play the same game on the same level and stuff like that. It's so much easier to go to the shop at the time and sit down and play your opponent. Uh, just in the same way it would be if I played chess. Wouldn't be trying to drum up my own opponents. I would just be going to the chess club and playing chess there. Chess probably takes even more homework and prep work than some of these games. Although with the constant evolving meta with these games, it can almost seem like a second job just to keep up with the game and what's going on with it. And while that's a beautiful thing about it, it can also be a reason not to. It doesn't always make sense to kind of half-ass these games and just only play them a little, because then they're hard to keep up with the constant rotation of cards and stuff like that. If you're investing in a game enough to have a serious deck and play it well, then it makes sense to play it, even a couple times a week. So it just depends on what you're looking for. All right, so let's get into talking about the actual games that are available. So the big elephant in the room that every other game is in the shadow of is Magic the Gathering. That was the first customizable card game, first thing in the genre that was like that. So this is back 1993, 94. The game booms, becomes the most popular thing, and sets off, the initial CCG booms, where every intellectual property had a CCG. So there's hundreds of CCGs in the late 90s for every game, every movie. They're all having a CCG. And there's been some resurgence, other waves of CCGs over the years, but generally they all died out and went away. And only three survived from the 90s, and they're the big three. That's Magic, Pokemon, and Yu-Gi-Oh! So I played Magic years ago. I think most people that play other card games now played Magic at some point, because it's such a juggernaut in the card game space. But Magic the Gathering is owned by Wizards of the Coast, and they're one of the most greedy companies I've ever seen in my life. They've done everything possible to squeeze money out of their players. It's unbelievable to me that anybody plays that game anymore, and that's where I stand on that. I quit that game years ago for these reasons. And so for those reasons, I can't recommend anybody getting into Magic. But that said, if you have reasons to play Magic specifically, that almost overrides that. You don't have to jump on board every hype train there and shell out your money to Wizards of the Coast just because you're playing Magic. There's inexpensive ways to play it casually for sure. So if you have people at your office playing Magic, you got another social group that's playing Magic, absolutely, that makes the most sense to jump into. When we're discussing these games, it's almost like there's two axes here, or two variables in a function, where one is how much you like the property, how much you like the game individually, and then the other is how available it is to you, how many people in your area are playing it. And high scores in one kind of makes up for one of the others. Ideally, you have a game you love that everybody's playing, but sometimes things aren't ideal. So if you have easy access to a group playing Magic that's very convenient to you or something like that, then go for it, enjoy it, play it. Just it is what it is, and that's what I got to say about that. So it just only makes sense if you have that group they're already playing Magic. But I got to mention, even for the context of the other, so without going too far into Magic, the way your resource system works is a certain percentage of your deck is going to need to be your energy cards there. They're called land cards in Magic. They give you your magic resources, your mana you use. And so like a third of your deck roughly is going to be these resource cards. And you need a certain amount of them at the beginning of the game to really get going. You can play down one per turn, but then they become really dead cards late game. And so some of your strategies involve thinning out your deck or trying to avoid that, play around that, but that variance that's introduced there by having like a third of your deck be these energy cards that you only need a few of at the beginning of the match, and you don't need too many and you don't need too few, or you don't want too few. So it's been the constant mechanic problem in Magic that many and most other games have really tried to solve. So most of the differences in mechanics in other games are really just trying to solve problems that are inherent in Magic because of the mechanics there. If we look at the next game of the big three, Pokemon, they have the same problem there in the game to some degree, but they've solved it kind of differently by having a lot of their other cards be able to fetch you, and you go into your deck and you pull out a particular energy card that you're looking for. Therefore, you only need one or two of those energies in your deck, and so a lot less of your deck is about is those energy cards. So there's a lot less of that variance there, and your decks become more about playing through your different combos different ways, and your competitive game becomes more about interacting with your opponent and what they're trying to do there. So the modern game is quite different than it was years ago, but they've kind of built it into this this kind of combo-y game. The people that play Pokemon tend to be a little younger. And so if you're not into Pokemon, I can't really heartily recommend it. But and the same thing applies. If you do like Pokemon, or if you got a really easy access to people that are playing Pokemon, then by all means jump in, play it. Uh, Pokemon intentionally reprints their cards a lot. A lot of their key cards for decks get reprinted a lot. So the downside of that is if you have one, it's not going to be worth very much for very long. The upside of that is if you want to buy a new deck for play Pokemon, you can buy the whole deck of cards, usually for like $20-$30. So it can be a very inexpensive game to get into. But again, like I said, it tends to be younger players, so you gotta either have the group you want to play with, or like Pokemon already, to go play. So the final of the big three is Yu-Gi-Oh! And Yu-Gi-Oh! Again, I can't recommend in this case for a new player because of the direction that they've taken the game. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is an awesome game. I love Yu-Gi-Oh! But what they've done, because of what they've done, really, and that is where every other game here that we're discussing here as a CCG has set rotation, where every year or two they'll have the older cards will rotate out and won't be able to be played in standard play. So when you're playing standard games at the shop, you're only playing with the last few years worth of cards. And different games handle that in different ways, but that's kind of the standard way it's done. And often cards will be reprinted, sometimes with different art or something like that to keep it fresh. But then you can play with your old versions of your cards, and so that way the older cards retain value. And then typically there's like older formats where you can play with the older cards, and they maintain different separate ban lists or something like that to maintain the balance there. Not with Yu-Gi-Oh! Though. In Yu-Gi-Oh! There was no set rotation ever. It's been 25 years plus of sets being printed with power creep. So each set is more powerful than the last set to encourage you to buy the new sets. That's the business model. That's how they keep it going. It wouldn't sell anything if there wasn't constant power creep. So it's just a different direction to go with the business model, and they're pretty transparent about that. So with 25 years of power creep, the mechanics of that game now, the decks that are possible and are that are used there are just so complex. It's unbelievable. So if you're already playing a game and you're looking for something, more advanced to get into, Yu-Gi-Oh is an awesome direction to go. But to a new player for your first game, I can't recommend Yu-Gi-Oh. It's just too much of a learning curve that you'll experience there. But it's not an expensive game to get into, because of the way they print cards there. When they print they'll print a whole new deck at once, and then they'll have that as kind of a starter deck kind of thing where you buy 3 copies of it because you have max of 3 of any card in Yu-Gi-Oh. Typically it's 4 in a lot of games, but 3 in some games, like Yu-Gi-Oh. So you'd buy 3 of the starter decks, and so you're out like 40 or $50, and that's all the cards you would ever need for that deck and your sideboard and all that. And then this kind of has the situation where there's different engines that you can swap out in different decks and bring in new cards. So it'll be a set of 3 or 4 cards you'll be bringing in, swapping out between decks, and really interesting deck building mechanics in that sense. And like I said, since they're releasing the new decks all at once, and sometimes they'll have a new set come out, like a booster box set, but it'll just be the cards for a few new decks. And so if you buy just that set, you'll have all these cards for these new decks, and they'll release a whole new deck like that into the meta like that. In contrast to something like Magic, where a new set very intentionally has good cards for all of the decks, all of the colors, all of the formats. A new Yu-Gi-Oh set will just have cards for just maybe 3 new decks, and that's it. Nothing for the other decks. In some ways, it's easier to keep up with because you don't need most of the new products, and it was never that expensive to buy the decks to begin with because there's not tons of expensive cards because again they reprint a lot of the other cards a lot there intentionally to keep the prices down. But that does mean if you do buy cards, they tend to lose their value pretty quick because they get reprinted so much. And what they like to do there is they print them at higher rarities. And in Yu-Gi-Oh, rarity is different foilings, different shinies on it, and so they'll have shinier and shinier versions of the card available. And that kind of keeps the prices going up in that direction. But then the base versions of the card get very cheap. So again, like I said, as something else to get into once you're in a card game, Yu-Gi-Oh is a great choice, but probably not for your first card game. And those are the big three. card games, and so unfortunately I can't recommend any of them to a new player. But like I said, if you have a reason for any of these, you got a group playing, then it makes sense to you to play, enjoy, and there's ways to play all of them without spending a lot of money there. All right, outside of those big three games, you're gonna find several other games that are played at pretty much every shop, or at least in every city. You'll be able to find a place to play them. And these are more the games that I can recommend to new players here. So the first game I'll talk about is the newest game here on the list. League of Legends Riftbound was just released late last year, late 2025, and it's just about to have its second set released here coming up at the end of February. So League of Legends, obviously the video game there, and then they're trying to expand in the TV show and this card game. They had a digital version. They had a digital card game there called Legends of Runeterra. I think they reused some of the art, but generally this is a completely new game, different game for the physical card game here, and it's been very popular. That's been the biggest problem with the first set at first, was that it was almost impossible to find in the stores because it was just sold out everywhere. It's been very popular. And so some of the biggest card game events we've had in the area lately have been these Riftbound events. So that's kind of an exciting one to play for that reason. Riot Games has signaled that they're really in it for the long haul. It's not going to be a quick game that's out for a year or two. They're looking to build it really into a whole competitive scene and a whole thing for itself there. So definitely one I can recommend. You don't have to have played League of Legends. It's that much better and sweeter if you have, and then you have all your champions and abilities and stuff that you're used to. But aside from that, it's just the names of the heroes and stuff like that from League of Legends. So, not a requirement at all. And so probably that would be the one I would recommend most to my audience here. You're going to be at least somewhat familiar with League of Legends, even if you're not a fan of playing the MOBA genre in itself or something like that. So that's League of Legends Riftbound. Like I said, brand new game. It's been hard to get and so a little expensive because it's just rare and stuff like that. But I think it'll really stabilize, and uh, it's really interesting to play. The different champions have really different decks available to them, really different feelings in a way that they play out. So as they keep adding more champions in there, it'll be interesting to see how that game evolves. And we're only on the second set now, so not at all late time to jump into that game. So the next game I'll discuss here is Disney Lorcana. This is a game. It's the first card game published by Ravensburger, who's previously published like board games and some other stuff like that. But now they're getting into this kind of card game space here. They had published that game Villainous. That's a Disney game as well. So Disney Lorcana has the license for all Disney movies, which isn't the most hype thing for my audience here of grown men. I know. Uh, but even stronger than the others, I'd say. If you have any reason to get into this game, you got people playing it, or you got, kids or nieces or nephews or something you want to get into this game, definitely don't hesitate to get in. Lorcana is an awesome game. I really like Lorcana. The mechanics, uh, and the cards, really refined mechanics. Uh, nice sets, nicely balanced. I enjoy the limited play. We'll kind of get into that constructed versus limited. But for playing that's the release events and stuff like that, where you're just opening packs and then building a deck out of those cards that you have just opened right then. And the game plays really well in that format. I really enjoy it. The fact that it's a Disney game is not really a plus or minus for me. I'm not a Disney adult in any way here. I don't know a lot of the newer movies. Uh, and it's not like I'm super nostalgic about a lot of the older stuff. Um, but it's not really a minus either. It's just Disney stuff. It's pretty neutral. So when I go to the events, there's some kids that are usually pretty good, and some adults that are usually pretty bad, and there's a couple guys like me that are actually like gamers, and the events just come down to between us, and it's kind of its own little game there, and I enjoy it. And so I would definitely recommend it as well. Um, Although it is kind of, in a sense, one of the weirder ones to get into because it's Disney stuff. But to give you an example of flavor, there's a set coming up in a week or two here, Winter Spell, and it's got a bunch of Pocahontas cards, and it's got a bunch of Darkwing Duck. They like to throw in a bunch like a '90s throwback for for the gamers like me. So there's always like they did Goof Troop or Goofy Movie last time, and um, you see some gargoyles was recently as well. But yeah, it'll be Darkwing Duck in this one, and then um, Mickey Christmas Carol characters. So just some random stuff in there. It's not too cringe, but it's nothing to hype over unless you love Darkwing Duck or Pocahontas. It's easy. It's the easiest one to talk to if you got a girlfriend you're trying to talk into this game or something like that. But then again, like I said, if that's what you're trying to do, then just play Villainous or something like that. Um, so it just depends what you're looking for. But Lorcana is a very healthy game. Again, Raffensperger's in it for the long haul. They're looking to make it build up the competitive scene, build up the local scenes, uh, and get multiple formats of the game going, and be in it for the long haul. So the next game we'll talk about is Star Wars Unlimited, which is published by Fantasy Flight. And I can't say the same things about that. It would be a more obvious IP for recommendations for my audience. Everybody loves Star Wars. And the Star Wars Unlimited is kind of this cool style, kind of, if you like it. It's like this retro comic book style. But Fantasy Flight is never in it for the long haul. They're never in it to build up the local scene or the competitive scene or anything like that. They just publish a game for a while and then they drop out, and people keep falling for it and buying into these games and then getting stuck with nothing when the game disappears and suddenly there's no more sets, no more events, no more anything, and the game just doesn't exist anymore. So the game has been pretty popular, relatively popular. This Star Wars Unlimited game has only been out, I don't know, 3 or 4 years here. Um, so it's done pretty well for that. But you know, I'd say I can't recommend getting into that as your first game. You're just gonna get burned, I think. But maybe they'll surprise me and that game will be around in 10 years. But I would doubt it. So that's Star Wars Unlimited by Fantasy Flight. So the next game to discuss here is the One Piece card game by Bandai. So this is based on the One Piece anime. And like many things here, if you're a fan of that, then it makes this obviously a high ranking choice on your choice of which game to play. If you're not a fan of that, it's pretty neutral. I don't know. I've never seen the show, but I don't really play this game. But it's been very popular because the show is popular. So um, it's been surprisingly a popular game. Has pretty big events for release events and stuff like that. Um, so if you're at all into that, it's definitely one to check out there. And again, that's made by Bandai. Bandai has a bunch of games going. We're going to discuss some other ones here, and One Piece is the most popular one there. So other Bandai games here, Digimon. There's been a few Digimon card games. This is the most recent one that's been out for 3 or 4 years here. Has some really cool mechanics. Everybody that plays it loves the mechanics, how they do their energy resource system and stuff like that, rather than being based on this variance of your cards. You kind of have this shared pool that you're pushing back and forth of how much you want to use versus how much you want to allow your opponent to use. And so if there's some Digimon being played around you, and if you're into Digimon at all or tolerate it, it might be one to look at there. So Dragon Ball, very popular IP. There's 2 Dragon Ball games. These are also Bandai games. what had happened was there was this game, Dragon Ball Masters. It's Dragon Ball Super Card Game Master. Well, all right. So the game is Dragon Ball Super Card Game, and it's been very popular and had a lot of sets and built up in complexity. Like all of these games, like I mentioned, it's kind of in the shadow of Magic, kind of trying different things with the resource systems, and so Dragon Ball ended up with a system where you're playing cards from your hand down as resources, but then added mechanics later, added complexity of bringing them back to your hand and swapping them out, and other things going on with your resources and other things. And it became a very complicated game and almost impossible for new players to get into. And that was only after a couple years. And so they were left with a situation of what to do there. And so what they decided to do at Bandai was split the game and make a new game. So the original game is now called Dragon Ball Super Card Game Masters, and there's a new game called Dragon Ball Super Card Game Fusion World that kind of resets everything mechanically from the beginning and starts with a fresh slate for how to build the game. So both those games exist and continue now. So, again, like I've said, if you're into Dragon Ball or tolerate it and there's Dragon Ball being played around you, it can be a good choice. And similarly for Gundam, Gundam's one, I like Gundam. I build the models. Um, I hadn't really watched the show. I've been watching some of the shows. They're kind of hit and miss, really, but the card game's been good. I like the card game. It's coming up to the third set being released now. And again, it's a Bandai game. Um, it's got some unique mechanics where you're trying to pair up your pilots and your Gundam suits and so on. And pretty solid, but relatively simple mechanically. Game, not a bad one at all to get into if you're looking for a game to get into. And the final Bandai game that we'll discuss here is one called Union Arena. And that's been popular as well. I think a lot of people play it kind of as a secondary game. And it has kind of a different release model where they put out a lot of sets, but each set is a different anime IP. And you can only build a deck from that set. And so it makes it pretty easy for them to balance. They kind of just keep on adding more decks into the pool. There's not crossover and complexity in that sense. So that's Union Arena, and so what that means for the gamers that you don't need to buy every set because there's no cards that you can even use in most sets unless they print a new set for the anime that your deck is. It's a very inexpensive game to play in that sense. Um, so those are all Bandai games. Very similar in the market. It kind of depends on what you like. Like I said, find that balance between what's easy and convenient for you to play versus what IPs you like the most and mechanics you like the most in the games. So there's a game called Flesh and Blood. We'll discuss that real quick too. So that's kind of made by former Magic players kind of thing. So they want to evolve the market, make a different game. And so mechanically it's quite different. And then in the market it's quite different as well. They don't reprint cards so much there at all. And so cards hold their value. And so it can be very expensive to get into this game because you need to invest hundreds of dollars to buy a deck. But then kind of the promise from the developer there is that they're not reprinting those cards, so they're not going to cut the value. So you can retain the value in your cards more certainly in that game than you can with the other games. So it's kind of a niche game, kind of a gamer's game for these reasons, because it's hard for a new player to get into that game being so expensive to get into when one of the cards costs what a deck costs in some other games. But, it's there, and something to look at and consider, and especially if you see it being played in your area. As we move further down this list, it's less popular games that are less likely to be played in every store. And even on that tier of that list, not every store is going to be playing every game. So we'll talk more about finding these games, but there are a few other games that get played some places. There's a game called Altered, there's a game called Illustrals, a game called Grand Archive, one called Keyforge, and one called Universus. So Keyforge is a little different in that you're not allowed to change cards from your deck. You buy the deck and it's kind of a random deck, and then you don't buy cards on the secondary market, so it's not a true customizable card game in that sense, but it is kind of alongside the others. It's not been super popular, but you see it sold and sometimes played. I think it's more targeted at younger crowds and stuff like that. I don't know. So Universus is kind of the same idea as Union Arena, where it's like a whole bunch of different IPs, and so each set is a different one. But they've done a lot of fighting games and stuff like that. So there's a Street Fighter set, there's a Tekken set, and stuff like that. So you build a character around Ken or whatever, and you're doing your fight as your battle there, as your match. Um, the other three are, I think, their own IPs. They're all kind of anime style. Grand Archive is probably the most interesting mechanically, it seems. Kind of some evolved mechanics there. Kind of, again, targeting like these former Magic players and stuff like that, built by and for these players coming from these other games. And I think Illustrials is more like Yu-Gi-Oh! And I think Altered is more like Pokemon. And they kind of got their own quirks and unique features and stuff like that, but it's just ultimately going to depend on what is even available to you. There's no sense in even looking for them if nobody's playing them within 50 miles of where you live, but if you got a shop down the street where they're playing it every week, once or twice even, so then that suddenly becomes a real possibility for something you can play there. So that brings us to the discussion of shops. Where do you play these games? Where do you find them? And for quick history thought here, like there were Magic shops where they were just doing Magic cards, but kind of didn't survive the market changes and everything, especially now in 2025, 2026. So what shops are left? There are still some shops. Well, there now are some shops that do card games at large, and they sell all cards. Some of them do sports cards as well. Some of them will focus on Pokemon and stuff like that, and different focuses and stuff like that. So those do exist for sure. And then the larger percentage is going to be board game stores or comic book stores that also do card games. And because those are the bigger stores that kind of survived all the ups and downs of the markets and stuff over the last couple decades. When they're focusing on board games and comics and stuff like that. So the trade-off as a player, like, not to get into too much irrelevant details on stores, but if a store is focusing on the card games, focusing on the tournaments, focusing on the players, and trying to keep up that, then it tends to be a bit of a different tournament experience than if it's a board game store or a comic book store that is offering the event and has it available in their space or whatever, where you're kind of an afterthought or whatever, rather than being like the focus core of their business. So it can be somewhat different experiences depending on the stores. And stores can be a whole different vibe on themselves. You get some small shop that's got like one guy there. It's a whole different vibe than like a big shop where they got a whole bunch of teenagers running the cash registers and stuff like that. Like one shop you can go in and talk to about the games and stuff like that. The other, they don't know. They don't really know anything. So it's just different vibes, depending on you know what's in your area and stuff like that. And so you want to check out the stores in your area, see where selling card games. Just look for what stores are selling card games, and then also look at the board game stores, the comic book stores. See what games they're selling, and see what games they play competitively there in the store. It's as simple as asking them. Sometimes stores will do like a board, a calendar on the wall or something like that. And a lot of stores will do like Facebooks and Instagram with their events and stuff like that. But all the events, all these card games are run on their own individual apps and websites now. And so ultimately that's where the events will be posted. But as far as finding which card game to play, it just takes visiting the stores and seeing what gets played there, seeing what store matches your vibe, matches like where you live. It can be convenience can mean a lot here. If you got a place like real convenient to you, your home, where you work, and they're offering events at just the right time. It's like 6 o'clock on a day you want to be over there anyways, and so it's like you just pop by there and in there. Then it doesn't so much matter that you're not really into Dragon Ball or whatever, if that's what the event is, because it's not that hard to get into the game and play the game, um, and that's how that works in my opinion. So ultimately, it's this decision you got to make on which game to play, uh, based on those factors. Like I said, the convenience versus the individual IP and mechanics that you like and want to play. We'll now talk about actually playing the game. Like once you've decided to play, so you're gonna need some things to play. For limited events where you might be opening the packs there and making your deck there, then you don't need to bring the deck with you. But if it's a constructed event where you're building your own deck, then obviously you need to build in and buy your card. Don't open a whole bunch of packs chasing cards. That's a dumb way to spend your money. Go on TCG Player or another website, eBay or another website, and buy the cards you're looking for. Or look with locals. You can trade or just buy for cash off of somebody else. These days, the way it works is you're just gonna look it up on TCG Player, see what the card's worth, and then that's what the cash trade is worth. So trade or buy for your deck, build your deck, bring that. You're always gonna play in sleeves now, so you'll buy sleeves, kind of dragon sleeves, kind of the standard brand there, and they'll cost you like $10 for 100 or whatever. The sleeves, and you put your card in your sleeves, and that way if the sleeve get damaged, it doesn't really matter, you just replace the sleeve. And if there's scuffs on it or something like that, otherwise you can mark your deck too easily and it becomes a problem. You add new cards into your deck and it's obvious which one's the new cards in your deck and stuff like that because they're brand new looking from the side. You avoid those problems by having all your cards in sleeves, so that's the standard. Everybody plays in sleeves. You're probably going to want a mat to play on. That's basically like a mouse pad. It's like a giant mouse pad. And so that way you don't have to put your cards on the table, and it's a nice comfortable place to play. So you get a mat. You're going to want some dice. These are just standard 6-sided dice, regular dice. You want a couple of those. Usually you need those depending on your game. And you want some bags to put the stuff in. Usually, ultimately, a backpack is the way to go. You put all the stuff in a backpack, bring it all there. You got it all on hand, organized. You're not a mess there. Easy, obvious advice there. So you go on the app or the website for the game. It's different for each game. Magic's got their app, Pokemon's got theirs, Yu-Gi-Oh's got an app. Riftbound's got a website, Lorcana's got a website. I don't know how Star Wars Unlimited does their event. All the Bandai games are on one Bandai app, and so on. So each one's got either an app or a website. And the store will list the event there ahead of time. And a good, competent store will list out all the details, the time, the price, and what the prizes will be, anything else like that. And you register on there. And just briefly on the registering, that'll ensure your spot. Usually there's a capacity. The capacity might be 32 players or whatever, and once it hits that capacity, that's kind of who gets in. That said, if you're over capacity, depending on the app, it might let you still register and be in line, or it might not let you register at all. It's still generally worth it to go to the store if it's convenient, and because some people just won't show up, and then you can get in that way. So just something to note there. inevitably there'll be some people that don't show up, and you can usually get into the events just by showing up. But you want to pre-register for the event, reserve your slot there, and hopefully you'll have all the information there on when and where. So you show up to the event, show up a few minutes early. You have to pay or whatever for the event. Typically for like a weekly event where you're bringing your own deck, it might only be like $10 or something like that, and then there'll be maybe some participation prizes and or prizes in the pool for the winner. For a larger event where you're opening a bunch of packs or something like that, it might be $30, $35, $40, depending on what you're opening and what the prizes are. So you show up, you pay, you get checked in, and then you wait for the first round pairings to go up. You'll receive your pairings on the app or the website, and then it'll tell you a table number and your opponent. And so depending on the store you're at and the size of the event and stuff like that, it may be kind of strict table numbers where they're very clearly numbered and you go to that table number, or it may just be a couple tables and the table numbers really don't mean anything. But you find your opponent. Good practice, confirm your match. Don't start playing and then realize you're playing the wrong person. So you check the name, you're this person, yep, cool. And you say, make some small talk, how you doing? Whatever. So you lay out your stuff, you put down your mat, and you shuffle up your cards. Even if they're already shuffled, they should already be shuffled anyways, but you're going to shuffle your cards there in front of your opponent. Kind of used to be more that you would shuffle your opponent's cards, especially at lower tier events. You don't typically touch your opponent's cards. That's kind of bad form. Going back to how expensive some of these cards can be, it just causes hurt feelings inevitably if people are touching each other's cards, shuffling each other's cards and stuff like that. So you shuffle your cards in a fair way, which usually, is like a mass shuffle. You're not riffle shuffling your cards. But there's some different shuffling methods, kind of more than I want to get into here. And then you offer it to your opponent to cut, and your opponent will cut your deck. And so that's kind of how some things are kept in check there. So you always cut your opponent's deck, and you're always expecting your opponent to offer their deck to cut. And if they're not offering their deck to cut, then they're probably trying to cheat you. Cheating's not a big problem here. Kind of the nature of this is if you get caught cheating, then you're not really welcome at the events, and there's only so many events. Kind of filters out people and kind of incentivizes people not to cheat even at the smallest events. It's depending on the game, more so the problem is uh how strictly the rules are applied, especially in old school Magic. It was very by the book, and you won your games by applying the rules. This is when you're allowed to play those cards. This is when you're not allowed to play those cards. And sorry, you're not allowed to play that right now. And you play it like that. So knowing the rules is important, but generally these games are played at a more casual, played by intent. Like this is obviously what I meant to do, and all that. No, but that said, you always cut your opponent's deck, just like locking your door. It doesn't mean you're expecting any problems there, but you got your opponent's deck. You draw your cards. And there's a lot of details to get into as you play these games, but you don't just grab a handful of cards off your deck. You lay out however many cards you're supposed to draw, if it's 5 cards or 7 cards or whatever, depending on your game, and make sure that's however many you're picking up, and that's the right thing to do. And then you pick up your cards and look at them rather than accidentally looking at too many or causing other problems like that. If you do have problems at all, really kind of just want to handle it with your opponent and talk it out real quick. Often in practice, you can also talk to your neighbors, depending on the level of the event, get their vibe, who's right here, who's wrong here. If there's any real conflict, you kind of just want to put the cards down, don't touch your cards, and put your hand up and yell judge. And there's always going to be a judge for the event, and they'll come over, sort it out, figure out who's right there. So you're always kind of better to call over judge. Definitely don't get in an argument with your opponent, even if you're right. Doesn't Like, don't argue with your opponent. It's just bad looks, bad vibes. It's never good. Just always call over a judge, um, and deal with things that way. Um, you know, I don't want to say anything too negative about the whole experience, but yeah, it's just following the rules, keeping your opponent mostly in line with the rules, on track, um, and play the game out, and 'cause it can be a very empty victory if you're rules sharking your opponent and gaining your wins that way. You really want to have the win, like no matter what they did, they had no shot coming into this even, and that's like the purest, most complete victory where they've already lost the moment they sat down, and it's not you winning an argument about rules with a judge. It's about the choices you made in your deck and how you're playing them. Um, and that gets at the depth and really the core kind of thesis of why these games are awesome, because it allows for these kind of things, um, these kind of total victories and uh, and total defeats. Like there's games where you lost before you didn't even know it. As soon as you sat down, you had already lost. But that's the other side of that coin. So with these kind of things in mind, of course, there's there's a lot to be said about how to win these games. Uh, Really, I could make a separate video about that at some point. Uh, but the core, much it's the same as video games. It ultimately comes down to ideally watching yourself play, or at least thinking over your games, really understanding why you lost the ones you lost, and ideally understanding why you won the ones you won, and how to avoid the mistakes you made, what the mistakes were, and how to avoid them. And that reflection process is going to what is going to is what makes you improve at the game. And it's a lot of reading strategy, looking at other decks, understanding other decks, playing. Uh, it's the big one. Experience. A lot of that goes into that. So very satisfying, complete victories in this game. Even though it's a random game of chance where you're drawing your cards and stuff like that, it's not random at all, in a real sense. But that said, don't be a bad winner. Don't jumping up on your chair partying or anything like that. It's just take the victory and yep. And don't be a bad loser, of course, and sulk off and storm out and flip the table or whatever. This is bullshit. Whatever. Whatever. Um, just congratulations. Yeah, well, you don't even need to say congratulations. Just say good game. Good game. Just like in video games. Just say good game. Shake hands. Well, nowadays it's more typically fist bumps than shake hands. Say good game. Fist bump. Pick up your stuff. That's it. Pretty much whether you win or lose. Just good game, and that's it. Um, and play to win, and eventually you get better. And you'll win some events, really rewarding, and that's ultimately what the card game experience is all about. And that is hopefully the points I've made. So, in contrast to most other games we play, where you're teaching other people to play or playing at their level, this is the competitive experience that otherwise only exists in video games, perhaps chess and some other niche games like that. But here, just by jumping on the app, getting the place to show up at Wednesday night, 7 o'clock, this shop, you show up there, you play your games, and really enjoyable for those reasons. So post below if you got any questions, comments, or anything else like that. I think that's all I wanted to cover on this topic. I hope this was useful, and I hope you have a great day. Thanks.